I'm really happy with how this final page came out, especially since there were so many faces. I thought it would be nice to share a page full of drawings done from life all in a single session, so you can kind of see how I put them together and the difference between different pose lengths. What you'll see here are some 20-minute and 40-minute poses that I did during a medium pose session here at my studio, School of Realist Art in Kansas City. In these drawings, I've used a gray-toned paper, which in this case is Kona Classic, and that has been discontinued, but I often use the Strathmore toned gray paper as well. I used General's charcoal pencils in medium, hard, and white, and a kneaded eraser. This first drawing was a 20-minute pose, and I decided to start off around the shoulders. I eventually included more, but I kind of took that as an anchor point for where to begin the drawing, and then I worked outwards, trying to keep the proportion in mind. So as you can see, I eventually made my way down the legs, and I have one entire hand in there. The other hand is a little bit blocked by a book, but I just did this all pretty slowly. So in this drawing, it looks like I took about half of the time, maybe a little bit more, just to get the block in. So I spent about 10 minutes getting the outline and a basic light and shadow shape before I started adding any detail on top of that. I'm always intimidated every time I start to draw a face from life because that time is limited, and I feel like it takes a while to really get a likeness on somebody or to get a form that I really find pleasing. And especially when I'm trying to draw the figure as well, it can just, be a lot of pressure for a limited amount of time. I usually keep it pretty simple to start with, so here I have some light and shadow shapes. I just got done doing a tutorial on my Patreon page, which is patreon.com/School of Realist Art. And in that demonstration, I showed how I tackle the face and the head more in depth and how I try to get those in proportion, some tricks that I use, and how I tackle the details on drawings where the head ends up being pretty small, like this one where the focus is a little bit more on a figure and it just happens to have a head included. I think that's one of the big mistakes that we make is we tend to want to go right away into small shapes and eyelashes and little tiny highlights, but we really need to get this basis first. Definitely spend the time and do that because I would rather have a drawing that is not completely fleshed out but that is pretty solid rather than one that I've spent a lot of time rendering but the proportion is all over the place. Moving on to the next one, I decided to put the figures back to back and to try and make them somewhere around the same size. This pose also included a portrait, and I did opt to get the figure in before I came back and started making shapes there in the portrait. And while I wouldn't say that they look exactly like the same person in the finished result, I think they look at least like they're related, and when I'm working from life in a limited amount of time, that's about the most that I ask of myself. This one was another 20-minute pose, so I'm going to end up bringing it up about to the same level of detail as the other, but you're going to see that the next drawings, which were 40-minute poses, there will be a lot more rendering and information included in those drawings. Sometimes I worry about the idea of having drawings on the same page that are not to the same level of finish, but I found that it really doesn't bother me in the end. Having that variety, I think looks nice. You can see more than one style on the same page, and it even makes the more finished ones feel even a little bit more finished than they are. Here we are moving on to a 40-minute pose. This is the third pose included on the page. And I'm going toward the head last, especially when there's a little bit of a challenging pose. And When I'm placing those eyebrows, I want to point out too that I'm thinking less about the eyebrows and the eyes, and I'm thinking a little bit more about the size and the shape of the forehead. Notice that when I start the head, I'm keeping it almost like a mask. I didn't go in there and get a nose. I didn't look for the brow bone. I'm just getting an overall shape on that face and an overall shape on kind of the size of the skull and the hair. And I'm even making adjustments there from my original marks. Although reclining poses aren't usually difficult, there was just something about the angle on this one that it was a little challenging to get everything right. And I wanted in the 40-minute pose to really take my time and make sure that I got the information as correct as possible before moving on to the shading. So once I was happy with the figure, then I added on the head. Although it may look like I'm getting into details here in the facial features, mostly what I'm looking at are shadow shapes. The shape of the shadow under the nose, the shape of the shadow on the top lip, the shadow underneath the bottom lip, and the shading in the eyes, as well as that shadow shape underneath the jaw. I thought this pillow was fun, so I decided to add some detail to it and get some information in there as well, so that we really understood the form and the texture of the object, instead of just leaving it as kind of an undescribed form there. I really love working with this gray paper because you can use white in an additive way to bring the form of the figure out. So you're not just having to think about how to carve into the form using the shading, but you can bring pieces of the figure closer to you or make it more round, almost like you're sculpting with the shading. Definitely this drawing ended up being my favorite on the page. I think she just has an expression, almost like she's smiling, that I really enjoyed, and I loved the abstract shape of her hair as well. Now, as we're going on to the fourth pose, I really enjoyed the gesture of this one, this kind of flow from the head down the shoulders and then the hip. I wanted to include more of the figure, but I was sort of running out of places to draw, so I decided to just include her top half. Since it was a 40-minute pose, once I was done with that, I wasn't sure if I wanted to really keep shading more on the figure or what to do, so I ended up putting her feet separately at the bottom. And although that's kind of a weird thing to think about, to have the figure and then the feet separate, it worked for the page, and it was also a nice thing to just give a little bit of a study to the feet by itself. As we start near the pelvis, the top leg, that thigh, is overlapping the bottom. Then as we move closer to the knee on the bottom leg, that bottom knee overlaps the top thigh, and then the calf just underneath the top leg is overlapping the bottom leg, and then the feet once again reverse. I found that really interesting, and hopefully this drawing portrays how I enjoyed that back and forth undulation there. And here is my completed page of studies. If you would like to learn more of how to draw, or you would like references for your own figure drawings at home, check out my Patreon, patreon.com/School of Realist Art. Thanks a lot, and I'll see you next time.